I have to start this story with something personal, because it's impossible for me to talk about Phil Porter without remembering a moment in my own life when everything felt like it was falling apart. There was a time when I thought life had turned its back on me, and that sense of abandonment left a mark I'll never forget. Maybe that's why Phil's story hits so deeply. He wasn't extraordinary in the traditional sense, no fame, no wealth, no connections. Just a good man with a soft heart who believed love was enough to build a future. Phil and Lena had been together since they were young. He imagined they would grow at the same pace, build a home together, celebrate small victories, and hold each other through the storms. But life had a twist waiting for him, one he never saw coming, and one that would break him before it rebuilt him. Phil worked at a small repair shop downtown, fixing old gadgets for people who barely remembered to pick them up. It was humble work, but he put care into every task. Lena, on the other hand, studied interior design and dreamed of decorating beautiful apartments for wealthy clients. She often described the home she wanted them to have one day, filled with plants, sunlight, and soft colors. Phil believed in those dreams with every cell in his body. But everything started shifting the day Victor Hale entered her life. Victor wasn't just rich, he was the kind of rich that came wrapped in confidence and polished charm. Expensive suits, perfectly styled hair, and a cold smile that hid sharp intentions. Lena met him through a university project, and from that moment on, something subtle but dangerous began forming between them. Phil noticed the signs long before Lena confessed anything. Anyone who has ever felt love slipping through their fingers knows that strange ache in the chest, the intuition that someone else has entered the picture. Lena became distant, distracted. She stopped laughing at Phil's silly jokes, stopped dreaming out loud with him, stopped reaching for his hand when they watched movies on the couch. Every night, Phil felt her drifting further away, and he didn't know how to pull her back. He tried cooking her favorite meals, tried surprising her with small gifts, tried staying up late to talk. But no effort can compete with the dazzling promise of a world someone else is offering. When Lena finally told him the truth, she didn't cry. That was the part that hurt Phil most. She sat on the edge of their bed, looked at him with tired eyes, and said she didn't think their lives were moving in the same direction anymore. She admitted Victor had been helping her with opportunities, guiding her career, showing her a version of life she had never imagined. Phil's heart cracked at the edges while she spoke. He waited for her to say she still loved him, or that she was confused, or that she needed time. But none of those words came. Instead, she said the one thing he feared most, "I think we want different futures." And that was it. She packed a suitcase. And she left. Phil didn't cry immediately. The first emotion that came wasn't sadness, it was shock. The kind that makes everything feel unreal, like he was walking through a fog. For days, he moved through routines like a ghost, replaying every memory, every detail, every laugh, trying to understand how love could evaporate so quickly. At night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what Victor had that he didn't. Maybe money really did make the world spin differently. Maybe kindness wasn't enough anymore. People often say heartbreak feels like drowning, I've felt it myself, but Phil's was more like being buried alive under everything he wasn't. And the cruelest part? He still hoped she would come back. But she didn't. Lena began posting photos with Victor, lavish dinners, luxury cars, a vacation in Santorini. Phil forced himself not to look, but the temptation was too strong. With every image, he felt smaller. And then came the moment that broke him completely, a video of Lena smiling on Victor's yacht, wearing a dress Phil could never have afforded. That smile, the one Phil knew so well, carved a wound deeper than words. He threw his phone across the room. That night, he allowed himself to cry. Not just because he lost her, but because he realized he had lost himself somewhere along the way. One morning, after barely sleeping for weeks, Phil looked at his reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. There was no light left in his eyes, no spark, no hope. And something strange happened in that moment, not anger, not revenge, but a quiet promise. A promise that he would not spend the rest of his life feeling like someone else's leftover. He didn't want Lena back. He didn't want to compete with Victor. He wanted to be someone he could respect again. That single thought lit a spark inside him that would soon become a fire. Phil quit his job at the repair shop 2 days later. Many people thought he was being impulsive, driven by heartbreak, and maybe he was. But he enrolled in night classes, business, coding, leadership, anything that could help him grow. He studied for hours, barely slept, pushed through exhaustion, and slowly regained pieces of the self-worth he had lost. Every chapter he read, every lesson he learned felt like stitching a wound closed. That's when fate, or maybe something bigger, stepped in. One late evening, after class, Phil walked home on a dimly lit street. He heard a faint cry for help near the corner. An elderly woman had fallen trying to cross the road. Without hesitation, Phil rushed to her, helped her sit, and called for assistance. He stayed with her until she was safe. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Coleman, a name he didn't recognize then, but soon would. She thanked him with a warm touch on his hand and insisted on buying him dinner sometime as gratitude. Phil, humble as always, tried to decline, but she was persistent. A week later, he met her for dinner, expecting nothing more than a pleasant conversation. But during the meal, she studied him with curious eyes, asking about his life, his dreams, his past. Phil didn't hide anything. For some reason, he felt comfortable enough to tell her the truth, the heartbreak, the struggles, the rebuilding. And instead of pity, she showed admiration. She told him resilience was a rare quality, and that most people crumble when life hits them. But not Phil. She said she saw something in him she hadn't seen in a long time, potential waiting to ignite. Mrs. Coleman revealed her identity gradually. She was the founder of a major corporate group known as Coleman Industries, a quiet giant in the market. She told Phil she needed someone young, hungry, and trustworthy for a special position. Not someone with a perfect resume, but someone with heart and discipline. Phil felt blindsided. This felt too big, too unreal. But she smiled and said, "Consider this a second beginning." And Phil, for the first time in months, felt a flicker of hope stronger than pain. He started working closely with her, almost like an apprentice. Mrs. Coleman was tough, very tough. She expected excellence, precision, and emotional intelligence. But Phil learned quickly. He absorbed everything she taught like a dry sponge hitting water. Every week he grew more confident, more polished, more capable. He wasn't the broken man Lena left. He was becoming someone entirely new. And little did he know that every step was pulling him closer to a future that would shake the ground beneath the man who took everything from him. Months passed, and Phil climbed the internal structure of Coleman Industries faster than anyone predicted. He learned strategy, negotiation, leadership, crisis management. Mrs. Coleman trusted him with delicate projects, and he executed them flawlessly. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, is that her intentions went far beyond simple mentorship. She was preparing him for something life-changing. And fate, with its poetic timing, was about to connect all the threads of his past and present in one brutal, beautiful twist. One afternoon, Mrs. Coleman called Phil into her office. She looked tired, reflective, as if she had been carrying a heavy secret. She told him she was stepping away from the company soon. Age, health, time, they were catching up. She needed someone to inherit not only her position but her vision. Someone who wouldn't let greed corrupt the legacy she spent decades building. Phil felt the world tilt. This couldn't be real. He tried to protest, saying he wasn't ready, that there were more qualified people. But she shook her head. "No, Phil. You're exactly the kind of man this company needs." His heart pounded, his palms sweated, but he listened carefully as she revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Coleman Industries had been quietly acquiring smaller businesses for years, building a complex web of ownership. And one of those acquisitions, finalized just recently, was a controlling share in Hale Enterprises, Victor Hale's empire. The same empire Lena had chosen over Phil. The same man who took the love of his life. The same man whose wealth shaped the new world she embraced. Phil sat frozen as Mrs. Coleman told him, "You don't just have a future here, Phil. You have power. Real power." When I think about the moment Phil learned he indirectly owned Victor Hale's empire, I remember a time in my own life when news so shocking landed on me like a thunderclap, news that felt too big for my chest to hold. That same mix of disbelief and electricity rushed through Phil as he sat in front of Mrs. Coleman. All the years of pain, all the silent nights replaying memories of Lena and Victor, all the questions about whether he was enough, suddenly, none of it mattered the same way. He wasn't the man who got left behind anymore. He was a man standing on the threshold of unimaginable power. But mixed with that excitement came a fear so sharp it was almost paralyzing. What would he do with such control? Who would he become? Phil didn't want revenge, not truly. What he wanted was closure. And maybe, deep down, he wanted the universe to acknowledge that he was worth something. Mrs. Coleman leaned forward that day and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, telling him that great power tests a person's soul. "Your integrity," she said, "is the difference between creating a legacy and becoming a cautionary tale." Her words stayed with him long after the meeting ended. Phil went home, sat on the edge of his bed, the same bed Lena once shared with him, and stared at the wall for nearly an hour. He thought about who he used to be, who he had become, and the man he wanted to be moving forward. The next morning, Phil stepped into his new role with quiet determination. The board members welcomed him with a mix of respect and curiosity. Some doubted him, others sensed something rare in him. Phil didn't speak much during the first meeting, but when he did, every word came out steady and intentional. He outlined strategies, proposed ethical reforms, and suggested a restructuring plan that protected employees and long-term stability. It wasn't just about proving himself. It was about honoring everything he had gone through. And in the corner of the room, Victor Hale sat with his arms crossed, staring at Phil without recognizing him at all. It wasn't until the end of that meeting that Victor approached him. "Impressive presentation," he said, extending a hand. Phil shook it, feeling a strange chill crawl up his spine. The man who once stole the love of his life was standing in front of him, unaware, unbothered, unaffected. Victor had no idea who Phil was. And Phil realized something powerful in that instant: he didn't need Victor's acknowledgement to validate his growth. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need revenge. He needed truth, and the truth was that he had risen far above the man he used to be. Over the next few weeks, Phil and Victor had multiple meetings together. Phil stayed reserved, professional, almost distant. Victor remained charming, polished, confident, but Phil began noticing cracks beneath the surface. Missed deadlines. Mismanaged funds. Suspicious contracts that made no ethical sense. Victor wasn't the brilliant businessman people believed him to be. He was reckless, arrogant, and entitled. And worse, he was dragging entire departments into chaos with his shortcuts. Phil documented everything carefully, gathering proof without emotion. The truth was right there, glaring and undeniable. And soon, the entire board would need to face it. But the universe wasn't finished weaving threads between past and present. One evening, as Phil left the company building, he heard someone call his name. When he turned, he saw Lena standing there, wearing a faint, uncertain smile. She looked different, less bright, more fragile, like life had taken something from her. Phil felt his heart stutter, but he kept himself composed. She walked up to him slowly, as if afraid he might disappear. "Phil. I heard you're working here now." "I didn't believe it at first." Her voice trembled slightly. He nodded politely. "Life takes strange turns," he replied. She bit her lip, searching for words, but the silence between them was loud enough to drown everything else. Lena finally admitted that things with Victor weren't what she expected. The glamorous lifestyle came with emotional distance, constant pressure, and a void she couldn't fill. She said she had been thinking about Phil a lot, wondering if she made a mistake. The old Phil, heartbroken, insecure, desperate, might have clung to those words. But the man standing in front of her now was different. Stronger. Wiser. Clear-eyed. He thanked her for being honest but told her gently that his life had moved in a direction he never imagined. Lena started to cry softly, realizing that the man she had left behind had become someone she could no longer reach. The next board meeting arrived like a storm. Everyone sat around a long table, tension crackling in the air. Phil stood at the front, displaying documents, financial reports, and hidden patterns of mismanagement, all tied to Victor's leadership. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone with anger. He simply presented the truth, piece by piece, with calm conviction. The room grew colder with every slide. Board members exchanged worried glances, whispering to each other. Victor's face lost color, then pride, then composure. When Phil finished, the room went silent. A silence that felt like the moment before a building collapses. Victor jumped to his feet, denying everything, claiming sabotage, trying to frame Phil as an opportunist. But the board wasn't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. And then Phil did something unexpected. He looked directly at Victor and said, "This isn't personal. This is about responsibility." That sentence echoed through the room like a judgment. Minutes later, the board voted unanimously to remove Victor from his position. Years of his arrogance crumbled in a single meeting. Victor stared at Phil with confusion and disbelief, as if searching his face for a clue. But Phil gave him nothing, not satisfaction, not anger, not revenge. Just truth. After the meeting, Victor cornered Phil in the hallway. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Phil paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Someone who learned to build himself from nothing," he replied. For a moment, Victor seemed ready to explode, but instead, he walked away with a hollow expression. Phil didn't chase him. He didn't deliver a dramatic speech. He simply let him go. It wasn't Phil's job to punish him. Life was already doing that. In the days that followed, the company underwent major changes. Phil became a symbol of ethical leadership and resilience. Employees admired his humility, board members trusted his forward-thinking strategies. And through it all, Mrs. Coleman watched him with quiet pride. One afternoon, she asked him to visit her home. When he arrived, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking thoughtful. "You've grown into a man I always knew you could be," she said. Phil thanked her sincerely, knowing none of this would have happened without her guidance. She smiled. "You saved me once, Phil. I only returned the favor." Before he left, she handed him a folder containing the final documents transferring full authority to him. Coleman Industries would now be under his leadership. Phil felt a warmth spread through his chest, a mix of gratitude, disbelief, and a sense of destiny. He walked home under a sky streaked with gold and pink, feeling for the first time in his life that he was exactly where he belonged. He didn't need Lena's validation. He didn't need Victor's downfall. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had become the man he once thought he could never be. But life has a way of giving closure in its own poetic timing. Weeks later, Phil received an invitation to a charity gala. He hesitated, but eventually decided to attend. When he walked in, the room buzzed with whispers. People looked at him with admiration, some with curiosity. And then, across the room, he saw Lena again. She approached him slowly, almost trembling. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. Phil smiled, a real smile, warm and gentle. "Thank you," he replied. And for the first time, there was no pain, no longing, no resentment between them. Just two lives that had diverged, and found peace. As the night went on, Phil stood on the balcony, overlooking the city lights. He felt a quiet sense of victory, not the kind fueled by ego or revenge, but the kind born from surviving heartbreak, rebuilding from ashes, and choosing growth over bitterness. In that moment, he understood something important: sometimes losing someone is the first step to finding yourself. And sometimes, the universe breaks your heart just to rebuild it in a shape that fits your future. Phil returned to the company the next morning with renewed purpose. He implemented new initiatives, focused on innovation, ethics, and genuine leadership. The employees were inspired by his journey, and they followed him not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. Every hallway he walked through, every decision he made, every challenge he faced, he did it with gratitude. His story, the pain, the heartbreak, the rise, it all meant something now. He wasn't living for Lena. He wasn't living against Victor. He was living for himself. Months later, Coleman Industries reached record success, with Phil leading with compassion and strength. The media began calling him the man who rose from heartbreak to power, but he never let those titles define him. He stayed humble, grounded, and focused. Whenever someone asked him how he got where he was, he simply said, "I started believing in the man I wanted to become, long before he existed." And that truth carried him through every season of his new life. He visited Mrs. Coleman regularly, updating her on the company's growth. One day, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, "You've given me peace, Phil. I can leave this world knowing everything I built is in good hands." Those words settled deep in his heart. He realized then that life had not just restored what he lost, it had given him more than he ever dared to dream. And the boy who once cried on the floor of his bedroom was now a man leading one of the most powerful companies in the country. That's what healing looks like. And there, standing in his office one quiet afternoon, Phil looked out the window and whispered a simple truth to himself: I didn't just survive. I transformed. His journey wasn't about revenge. It was about purpose. About rising. About loving himself enough to build a future brighter than the past he left behind. And that, more than anything, was his greatest victory. You know, telling Phil's story always makes me think about how life tests us in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it breaks us so deeply that we think we'll never stand again, and yet, that's exactly where transformation begins. Phil didn't just rebuild his life, he reclaimed his worth, his voice, and his destiny. If you felt something while listening, drop a comment saying, "I deserve better," because that small affirmation might be the first step to your own turning point. And who knows? Maybe your story is about to take a powerful turn too.